Welcome back to another episode of the About Consent podcast. I'm so glad you're back. Today, I am interviewing Anna Sonoda, who is the author of Duck Duck Groom, Understanding How a Child Becomes a Target. Duck Duck Groom is a really comprehensive book on the topic of child grooming. And if you've never heard about what grooming is, you're going to hear about it today for sure and really help you understand what it is, why you need to know about it as a parent, and what you can do. And this book has some really great tactical, hands-on, actionable information, which is what I love so much about it. It says on the back, in these pages, you'll discover how to recognize the 4 stages of grooming, assess the unique risks posed by familiar people and places, report and disrupt a would-be predator, really important for prevention, and how to protect minors in your home and community. So I can't say enough good things about this. I'm so excited that she's here for this interview. I know you're going to love it. So let's dive in. Welcome to About Consent, a podcast that sparks conversations about prevention, healing, and justice to end child sexual abuse, while also creating consent culture now and for generations to come. This is a safe, shame-free, and judgment-free zone where both survivors and those who support survivors are welcome. I'm your host, Rosalia Rivera. Welcome, Anna. Thank you for joining me today. I'm so thrilled to have you here and talk about your work and your book and all the things that you're doing to help parents keep their kids safe.
Thank you, Rosalia. It's such a pleasure to be with you and your audience today.
So I have so many questions. First of all, I just want to say I really loved the book. There's so many things I was like constantly nodding my head. Yes, 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 exactly. I learned new things, which, I'm constantly researching and diving into this. So I love that you had these new perspectives that I hadn't even considered yet. And I was like, I have to get her on the show. I'd love for you to share a little bit about your professional journey, how your clinical experience with sex offenders shaped your understanding of grooming.
Super. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, which is a really long way to say that I'm a psychotherapist who has a master's in social work. And when I was training to get my master's, I had the opportunity to have in-person experience in a counseling setting. And being as I knew nothing about sex offenders and had a long-term goal to work with couples, I thought if I work with sex and intimacy and arousal in this population, then working with your average couple is going to seem like a walk in the park. And as I discussed it with the other peers in my cohort, they all said, why would you choose that? That seems like a strange thing to choose. I'm not going to work with that population. I'm not going to work with that population. And I thought, I'm either going to learn something that I don't know, or I'm going to gather insight in some way that might shape my life in the future. And I went in with open eyes and green as could be, and really had a life-altering experience because I had the opportunity to participate and give individual counseling using cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really evaluating what is your belief structure and how does that belief structure inform your thoughts, which then informs your actions and behaviors. What I learned when I went in that very first day was that this waiting room of clients looked like any other waiting room in any other part of Atlanta. And that has informed how I walk through the world, because we don't know if somebody is a sexual predator by looking at them or by analyzing what they wear or by recognizing what their economic class is. We really have to look at their behavior. We can talk a little bit about that as well today.
Yeah. And just for a little more context, you were working with sex offenders as a population specifically to help them do what?
Great question. I left that out. That's a really important part of this conversation. So these were all individuals who were either awaiting sentencing or who had already been sentenced, spent time in prison, and then were coming back into the communities. So they were maybe reintegrating with their families. They were reintegrating with finding a place to live, finding work, and coming back to live a quote unquote normal life now that they were on the sex offender registry in most cases, and having to really balance the needs of their probation, which required them to come and engage in counseling. So they would participate in individual counseling as well as group counseling. And in some circumstances, if these individuals were married or in long-term relationships, their spouse or partner might also come in for a session here or there. So these were not individuals who were opting into cognitive behavioral therapy. These were individuals who were mandated. And that's an important piece of this conversation, that there is a structure within the justice system once somebody has been charged with child molestation, for example, which does include oftentimes not only serving time in prison, but then some assistance when they come out to try to modify some of the behaviors and prevent recidivism. Recidivism is just a really long way to say not doing it again. And right now, statistics reinforce that about 20 to 24% of the time, sex offenders on the registry will reoffend. And as you and I will both agree, Rosalia, that's far too high.
Yeah.
And we haven't quite fixed the system entirely. So that's why this conversation is even more important, because many of the people in my life that I know, and maybe as well for you, they look at the sex offender registry as the pinnacle. They say, I checked on the sex offender registry and their name wasn't on it, so they must not have committed a crime. And
Right.
what's important to remember is that most sexual crimes against children go unreported. They
Right.
never, ever see the inside of a courtroom. So when we're looking at the sex offender registry, we're only looking at about one slither of a very large pie. And
Right.
so I think that we need to focus in on how do people behave and improving our ability to detect grooming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such an important point to emphasize is that not only is it such an underreported crime, but even when it does go through the judicial system, it seems 2%, I think, is the statistic currently of offenders that actually get convicted. And that's incredibly shocking when I remember reading that statistic. So not only are the ones that are convicted being put on the registry, but there's so many who even if they are reported, it doesn't go to conviction, so they may not end up on that registry regardless. So, but that's not what we're here necessarily to talk about today. I wanted to just highlight that and bring it up because you gleaned a lot of really important information from being able to speak with these individuals and learn about their behaviors. And I believe that from what you shared in the book, this is one of the things that led you to deciding to write Duck Groom. Can you talk a little bit about what made you decide to finally write this book based on the work that you were doing?
It's an interesting story. I found myself raising little kids, and like many parents, I would go to the playground or to the coffee shop with my friends, and conversations would begin. And I noticed time and time again that what I understood to be risky about other adults that we might trust with our kids or other older children that we might have in our lives around our younger children, that there was a big disconnect between what we knew clinically and what my friends knew. And these were smart men and women who were doing the best they could raising their kids. And somehow there was an absence of information that I found to be second nature. And then it dawned on me that it was second nature to me because I got to sit in the room with convicted offenders who gave me the playbook of how they assess and evaluate potential targets and potential families based on vulnerabilities. And I would have the same conversation again and again with individuals in my life, and they would say, "No, it's the creepy van down the road. It's the person driving the ice cream truck. It's the stranger I need to worry about." And while stranger danger has been propelled throughout society for many decades, it's actually not held up by statistics. And what we know to be true is that in more than 90% of the cases, that children are groomed by somebody that they know and trust. And that also includes us as caregivers. So we are often the ones on the front lines. And I wrestled with knowledge that I had and watching a disconnect in my day-to-day world. And I thought, maybe I could contribute something that might move the needle. And I hired a developmental editor and began the process of writing this book. It's funny because when we first started working together, she said, okay, well, write down the stages of grooming, because she knew it was really important for me to describe the stages. And so I came up with 9 stages. And in our first meeting, she said, you can't write a book with 9 stages of grooming. So I went back to the drawing board and tweaked and pulled. And what I like to focus in on is explaining grooming in such a way that adults and older kids can understand it. Because with people to recognize what grooming is, we have the opportunity and the potential to eliminate 90% of all child sexual abuse that's going on in this country and around the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's great that your editor helped you structure it, because you really wrote it in such a way that I think it is really great for parents who are trying to wrap their heads around this. I think because, as you mentioned, there's so much, I think, bias towards what the boogeyman looks like, right? I think we're influenced by media and the news and movies or stories of who that individual looks like. But even when I think individuals are presented, parents are presented with, it could be someone in your family, they think that they can spot them easily because they'll just know, oh, they're acting a certain way and I'm not going to like them. And I love that in your book, you talk about that at length to say you're actually not going to think that person's creepy. You're actually going to probably really like them, and you need to check that. So I really love that you dove into that. And I'd love for you to maybe unpack a little bit of that for those, first of all, who are unfamiliar with what grooming is. I know many of my listeners are followers of consent parenting and they may know this, but I'd love for someone else to break down what grooming is and what are some of the stages without going too far in. But I think specifically also to highlight how easy it is for someone to groom an adult who may be really unsuspecting. So I know there's multiple parts to that question.
That's great. I'd love to dive on in. So let's begin with grooming. Grooming is a perverse form of courtship that predators use to gain access to families and children. And I'd like to describe grooming as the 4 Fs: flattery, favoritism, forbidden fruits, and fear. And you'll notice, and your listeners will notice, that it starts with flattery. It starts sweet. And just like courtship between 2 consenting adults, you have the opportunity to woo that person with kindness and offers to be a positive influence in their life. And similarly, what I discovered when I was researching for this book and also sitting with clients is that time and time again, they would use, whether it was their access through coaching or teaching or religious setting or medical setting or family setting, they would use that relationship and the offer to do something nice, the offer to compliment, whether it's a caregiver or whether it's a child, but keeping the relationship from the position of something that is very positive. And we have to start with flattery because it makes sense. I'm a mom myself of 5 kids. I'm very wary of somebody who's aggressive or rough around the edges or abrasive with my children. But I'm drawn to individuals who are warm and kind and generous and complimentary to myself, whether it's because of my parenting or because of how my kids behave, or to my children. And we see that on the rise, especially now with the advent of online profiles and online living. So much of our world, even as parents, we're watching it obviously with our children, but as parents, we are facing a time when our lives are, in many cases, put out in front of others. They're put up for liking, for following, and this actually enriches the possibility for potential predators because they recognize, oh, this person's value comes from their likability or their their public profile being something that I'm following or being interested in. And what I'm often inclined to tell parents and people that I teach is that it's very important that we look at what is going to designate somebody from a potential predator to somebody who's being nice. Because oftentimes when I teach, the first question I get is, wow, I'm a teacher or I volunteer with my kids' scouts troop. How do I show that I want to be nice? And I say the important differences when we look at potential predators and people who want to be nice is that individuals who are not trying to isolate my child are working with me. So, for example, any individual who wants to discourage my participation, discourage my supervision, discourage my communication, whether it's through emails or online messaging systems, that is a red flag for me. The other thing I'm also looking out for are what I call the seesaw principle, which is this idea that individuals in the life of my child who want to treat my child like they're an adult peer rather than a child. So indicators of that might be something like talking about employment woes, talking about financial difficulties, talking about problems in the bedroom or about sexual topics with children that are largely inappropriate and not age appropriate. Or you'll see the other side of that seesaw, which are adults who are putting themselves on the level of my child who is attempting to act like a peer. So how might this show up? You might look for an individual who dialogues like the children when they're in groups together. So using the common vernacular, using the slang of the day. It was a little bit different when I was young, but for our kids nowadays, engaging in that, it might mean being the teacher who allows the kids to cuss in class or to break those little teeny tiny rules because they're a cool teacher, they're an approachable teacher. It might also look like an individual who's engaging in games and entertainment that are on level with somebody who's an adolescent, because that's one way in which they can engage and stay current in that child's life by doing things that the child enjoys. So those are a couple of things that I think parents who might be listening can be attuned to, is that seesaw principle, that idea that the adult is either going to treat the child like another adult peer, or they're going to lower themselves to imitate and resemble one of the kids in the group.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. I think this highlights a lot of what I think parents don't tend to see a lot of times too, especially if they don't have that visual access of the child's in the classroom with the teacher. And sometimes kids don't communicate a lot about what's happening, but they might have, you mentioned in the book that if you hear your child like going on about a teacher or going on about a particular individual, it's not necessarily to say that person is grooming your child. It means pay closer attention, stay on top of it, maybe be more of a presence. And I love how you really share a lot. I mean, you have so many great tips throughout the book. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight also that I thought was really helpful, that I think even when, as I've been teaching about, grooming, a lot of it has been a focus on the child. What behaviors are you noticing between the adult and the child? But I think it's really important to also highlight, and again, I love how you really brought this home in the book, is how those offenders are going to really try to ingratiate themselves with the adult first, because they're the ones that give them the access to the child, right? Without that first access, they really can't get to the child to then start grooming the child. So can you talk a little bit about what behaviors adults can look for, and how do offenders groom entire communities? Because I think this also impacts whether if you as a parent have a suspicion or you see some behavior that is inappropriate and you're maybe then afraid to raise the issue with others because you're doubting yourself, and there's maybe the teacher of the year or the favorite uncle or whatever position they're in, that they are protected by the community because they've groomed the community. Can you talk a little bit about how that happens, what parents should be paying attention to? And I really want to emphasize, we only have an hour, and your book is riddled with amazing tips. I would love for you to share maybe just one or two that parents can say, "Oh, I never thought of that." And because I really want them to get the book because you have so many great tips. But if you can share one or two that parents should look for in terms of how offenders will groom adults, either directly or as a whole community.
Okay. So using our time wisely, let me start with an umbrella concept that I think is important for us to think about, which is that predation runs on gas, grooming, access, and space. So if I'm a potential predator, my number one goal is to build trust with caregivers who have the authority to give access and space with their child. So if that's our framework that we're going to work within, then if I'm a predator, I want to do everything in my power to be the type of adult that you as a parent are going to trust and want your child to spend time with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build my reputation on positive things. I'm going to build up my support team, if you will. So those around me are going to say, "Oh yeah, she's a fantastic coach. He's a fantastic teacher." Building and building this sense of trustability, likability, reverence, possibly in a community. Predators are extremely talented individuals, and they're also chronic liars. So we often find that these individuals will put themselves in environments where they can misrepresent their their expertise or their talents so that the perception in, let's say, a small community is, oh, yeah, this is the best individual for this role with our kids. And just by process of being in that community, other individuals will say, oh, you trust them? Oh, Rosalia trust them? Then I'll trust them. Oh, and if Anna trusts them, then Sally will trust them. And you see how in community systems, we must rely on each other. So
Right.
oftentimes, when it comes to reputation, just having one person's faith in an individual is enough to create a snowball, if you will, of positive regard. And once that positive regard is achieved, it is very difficult for those individuals who get a gut feeling or observe something inappropriate or observe any of the indicators of the seesaw principle that we talked about earlier to speak up and to say, something's just not right about how much time this individual wants to spend with our kids without our participation, without our supervision. That's strange that this neighbor wants to invite the young 11 to 13-year-old boys over to his house at such a frequent rate. These are things that, if that person's in higher standing, our silence is more likely because we fear not only our own consequences, but possibly a communal response that says, what are you talking about? He's been so generous. This is the person who's maybe paying for things or giving the kids things or giving families things. We see this again and again with the concept of gifting. And what's important to remember about grooming is that gifts are tangible and they're also intangible. So it could be money, it could be food, it could be access to tickets to something or registration for something that a child or their family couldn't afford. And that endears families and caregivers to think, wow, this person cares about you as our child and they care about us as a family. But it's really important for your listeners to remember that predators are keen observers of family systems and figuring out the vulnerabilities. So if they observe, oh, there's vulnerability when it comes to finances in this family. There's vulnerability when it comes to male role models or male leadership in this family. I can fill that gap. Once that occurs, then you have a reinforcing loop almost, because you have a child who's gaining something from a potential predator, the family who feels very grateful. So many families think, wow, this person is fantastic. They're like an answer to our prayers. And it can be so challenging for somebody who's watching something, even within a family system from afar, to say, that something doesn't sit right about this because when we look at the grooming process, it's a grooming process that starts with flattery. Then we move into favoritism, which says, you are the identified kid. You're the greatest kid on the team. You're my favorite student in this class. You're my favorite nephew. And then it moves into those forbidden fruits where I'm going to tempt a child with things that I know their mother or their father or their caregiver would probably not allow. So that by the time we get into that fourth stage of fear, we've reinforced through shame and guilt their own silence. So predators are very keen about manipulating the entire system to their own personal advantage.
Yeah, and I think this is where a lot of when people read headlines, they're seeing someone in the community was arrested for something and the community is shocked, right? They're like, I can't believe it. He's such a nice guy. He seems so family friendly, or he had kids and a family. Like I would never have thought, And so I think it's so important that we really examine our biases, number one. But two, to recognize that, yeah, someone who is acting inappropriately, if you have a gut feeling, not to dismiss it because they are so revered by others. And it's like a self gaslighting. I must be crazy, like seeing something that maybe isn't there. Or even if someone does say something, a parent recognizes it and says it to someone else. And then, like you said, they think, oh, so and they're so nice. And why would you think that about them? And it really challenges parents to say, okay, maybe I should pursue this, or maybe I am seeing things. What would you recommend for parents to do if they do see these signs? And what are some early warning signs that parents should be aware of, or that they can, if they see it, that they can interrupt?
That's a great point. And I think to just piggyback on something that you were just saying is that when we hear scuttlebutt or gossip in our communities about a certain individual or a pattern of behavior by a certain individual, it's very important that instead of averting our eyes to that observation that parent has, is to lean into that and to ask more questions, get more information, because these are patterns of behavior. We haven't talked about that just yet, but it's very important that people remember that predators are serial offenders. Most of them have abused more than one child, and they often lily pad from environment to environment. And if the environment around them sort of catches on or feels weird about their behavior with the children or with families, oftentimes they will just abruptly leave an environment or a community to find another school to work in, to find another troop to volunteer. So it's very important that we are first and foremost keen listeners. When it comes to parents, the best sort of core basic advice is we've got to show up, look up, and speak up. So show up. We need to be present with our kids when they participate in activities that give individuals access and space with our children. Now, take me, for example. I've got 5 kids out in the world somewhere, and I'm not with them. So being there is sometimes not available or not appropriate. I'm not going into the classroom, for example.
Yeah.
But it's important that I've evaluated the programs, the policies in place, and done my due diligence because I select, alongside my spouse, I select the environments where my children spends time. And if we run on this framework that predation runs on gas, the fuel for child sexual abuse is gas, then access and space are up to us as parents. So to show up, we've got to do our due diligence. And then when we're in those environments, we need to look up. We need to put our phones down, resist the temptation to write an email, and we need to pay attention. What's the dynamic like between the coach and our child? And if it's not our child that's being directly affected, I noticed there's a pattern of behavior. I noticed that one student or that one player, that one scout the leader is sitting awfully close to them. They keep rubbing their back or they keep their hands on them. I'm curious. I want to know more. I want to pay more attention. And then when you notice those things, to speak up, because silence fuels predators and it fuels abuse. So it's so important that we use our voice that is stronger and more powerful than most parents realize to bring attention. So I encourage families, if they're uneasy about something, that they bring up the behavior in front of other people.
Mm.
Not send a subtle email to the individual saying, I noticed that during practice you were having your hands on Jimmy and this makes me uncomfortable and I prefer you not do that. Because what happens? Isolation. Isolation
Right.
of communication means that you don't hear it, I don't hear it, Sally doesn't hear it, Julia doesn't hear it, etc. So it's really important that we call out behaviors in a public format. And one of the points that I think is really important is that parents have observations that can be useful to other parents. For example, when I'm picking a program or an activity, I'm going to maybe show up before I've even enrolled my child and talk to the other parents or talk to the caregivers or talk to the individuals who are in regular attendance and say, what's this like? What's this coach like? What's this group like? What's the dynamic like? What are the rules about observation and supervision? During COVID, we all experienced many organizations with our kids who said, you can drop the kid off, but you can't come inside. You can't observe. And that made me think, wow, if I was a predatory coach, instructor, tutor, teacher, this would be a potential landmine for me. And I'm always a fan of randomly showing up. So
Mhm.
you have a plan to, for example, you have a plan to be there to pick the child up at 5 o'clock. If you can work it out in your schedule or have somebody who's a representative of you to show up maybe 30 minutes earlier, just to observe from afar or observe and say, hey, I'm one of those parents. I'm the kind of parent who's going to show up and I'm going to be watching and paying attention. I'm not going to be hounding you. I'm not going to be assuming that something nefarious or wrong is going on. No, I'm actually going to partner with you because the other side of this coin, Rosalia, is that parents and adults who work with kids want to know that their reputation is protected. And we too often get into this conversation and think it's only about protecting children. And it is. That is the lead of this conversation. But the other
Mhm.
part is that when I volunteer for an organization working with children, I want to know that the policies in place and the system in place, the communication with parents and administrators is such that my reputation is being respected so that there's no room for gray area. There's no room
Mhm.
for misinterpretation. And in that way, we are doubly protecting not only kids, but we're also protecting adults who are caring and loving and want to serve in healthy ways with our children.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I love all of that. And I really was happy to see that because I always call it the interrupting, like the unpredictable parent. Show up early. You don't necessarily have to have a specific reason, even. It's just, oh, I got out early and I figured I'd come by. And I think that for safe adults, that should be welcome. It's, oh, great. I remember where there were situations where the parents were late and the caregiver or the teachers or coaches were like, where is this parent? And not I know that parenting has its ups and downs and moments of you're a hot mess parent and other times you got it together. So this isn't a judgment on anyone, but it is just to remind parents showing up is really important. And I like how you talked about that in the book that be at the events as often as you can. And if you can't be there, send someone else so that they're representing on behalf of you. And that the adults who are in charge see that this child does have someone who is looking out for them. Because as you mentioned in the beginning of the book, one of the stages is targeting, and they're looking for children whose parents aren't as present, who may not have someone who is really looking out for them. And so I know a lot of times we are really busy. We kind of overschedule sometimes. And I think that it's really important, just from a philosophical parenting point of view, that we really examine priorities and make sure that we are as present as we can be for our kids because we want to build a community that can support and be the village that I think all parents need. But we still have to ensure that village is a safe village, and we can only do that by being proactive participants in that in various ways, right? It doesn't have to be that we're there all the time, but you mentioned maybe sending the other parent or a grandparent or another caring adult or caregiver who can be present when you can't. And that is calling on your village, but also making sure that those adults that you're calling on are also safe. So really, I think that what I really felt was so powerful about your book is that it raises awareness about so many aspects of how we call in a village and make sure that village is safe to support parents because it's not about doing it alone. It's not about being paranoid of who's the teacher and who's the caregiver and can I leave this person with my family member. The goal of your book was really to empower and educate parents so that they're both aware of what grooming is, how it happens, how to intervene or prevent it altogether, but also to say we do have so much more power than we think as parents to protect our kids. And I loved also that you talked about peers. And before we wrap up, I was wondering if you can just touch a little bit on that because as we know, rates of peer-to-peer abuse have been going up. A very recent research has shown that it's actually up to 70% now, where it was 40% previously, which was still a very high number. But now we're seeing that it's increasing for so many reasons. But I was glad to see that you talked about that in the book too, because we tend to think of only adults as offenders and juveniles are as well. So can you touch a little bit on that before we wrap up? And then we'll just have some last moments to talk about just what's next for the book and how parents can find it.
Sure. I just want to make one other note too about our conversation about a stand-in is that this is the important part about knowing and meeting the other parents who are participating in a given activity. Because I can watch not just my child, but I can watch other people's children. And the other value is that most children, if they are going to tell about child sexual abuse, typically tell 60% of the time when they tell a peer. So it's very important that we have conversations that are open about child sexual abuse and grooming, because even if it's not happening to our child, they might have a child in their life that their friend who
Mm.
tells them something that they maybe tell them, hey, you've got to keep this a secret or don't tell anybody. So I just wanted to squeeze that in there. When we're thinking about peers and peer-on-peer abuse, it is something that sends shivers through most parents' spines. In this day and age, we want more and more for children to be interacting in person and having that face-to-face time to play and imagine together. And unfortunately, because of too many reasons to count, but one being access to pornography at earlier and earlier ages through the internet and some parameters of internet restrictions being vastly different between households, even in the same communities. We've found ourselves in a situation where children are utilizing, whether it's devices or their own knowledge of sex and sexuality and exposure to sexual material to harm and humiliate peers. And we're noticing an enormous rise, as you've said, between peer-on-peer abuse. The highest rating age group typically tends to be about the age of 14. When families are listening to this news or hearing this maybe for the first time, I think the important thing to do is remember that you and your relationship with your child is the cornerstone. The greatest protection that a child has is the relationship with a caregiver or a caring adult. So this might mean having conversations if your child has access to the internet about what we do with photographs, what we do with ourselves and our image and our bodies when it comes to our peers, our friends, and how do we show respect to individuals who are maybe younger than we are, but we have time with them. So one of the things I mentioned in the book is sometimes there are situations where there's a power imbalance between two children. Maybe if I'm in a real pinch and I've got to leave a child at home with another child, there's typically going to be a power imbalance between the ages of those two children, and that can get exploited. And nowadays, because of this very prolific, pornographic, toxic environment that children are often exposed to at a very young age, first exposure to pornography in this country, in the United States, is somewhere between 7 and 9. So we have to be really cognizant and aware of what are our children watching? What are they seeing? And what is normal to them? Because sometimes these kids are getting wrapped up in receiving child sexual abuse material or CSAM from friends because their tween girlfriend sent them a picture and so they're sending it off. So now that child could potentially end up on a sex offender registry as a juvenile because of something that was facilitated through a device. And so we as parents are being thrust into conversations and a situation that is highly risky and has legal consequences, potentially long legal ramifications, just because of the decisions that other children might make. So I commend groups like the Scouts, for example. They have recognized this risk of peer on peer abuse. And one of their new policies is to not allow children with less than a 2-year age gap bunk up in the same camping tents. Why is that important? It's important to recognize that within mental health, we used to believe that a 4-year age gap, if sexual behaviors occurred between children who were, let's say, 12 and 16, if it was within that 4 years, then it was brushed off as curiosity or kids being kids. And now what mental health practitioners are doing, and what we know to be true, is that really that age gap should be much closer. So we need children, when we need parents to be cognizant about, is it reasonable for an 8-year-old to be playing with a 3-year-old? Is there adequate supervision? And what I always like to inform parents of is that 82% of child sexual abuse occurs in only two places: the home where the child lives and the home where the predator lives. So whenever possible, instead of doing a play date at a house, go out somewhere. Go meet at a play site, go meet at a playground, or go on a hike or go outside, because we can diminish the risk. We have the power to diminish the risk of child sexual abuse when we know how to detect grooming, protect our kids, and reject grooming efforts on the part of predators.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that about, I think peer-to-peer, it's still something that most parents are not aware of. And unfortunately, because of that, there's so many increased risks because of opportunities and access that a lot of older children will have with younger children. And there's actually, I was at a conference a couple of months ago where they were talking about how prevalent peer-to-peer violence has become, but how a lot of education is starting to be geared towards adolescents and the post-pubescent group, middle school and high school, on teaching appropriate sexual behavior for their age group, and making sure that there's not the interest to experiment with younger children. So really beyond just like healthy relationships, but really very obviously talking about what's inappropriate versus just the standard sex ed or even consent education, but a real focus on inappropriate sexual behavior and to move away from that, especially because unfortunately, so many youth are seeing porn as their sex education and as what is appropriate behavior to experiment with. So I think that's such an important thing to highlight, is that it's happening at younger ages, the exposure. And unfortunately, because of that, if parents aren't having those early conversations, it is going to really put them in a much more vulnerable position, either to offend or to be offended.
And we have, sorry to interject, but we have the greatest tool at our fingertips. We live in the house with our child. We
Yeah.
get to observe, changes in behavior, sudden disinterest, sudden changes in friendships and relationships, and the in groups and the out groups. So we have to be keen observers, not just of what happens outside in the world, but we have to be so cognizant of what's normal for our child, what's not normal. Am I seeing sudden changes in hygiene, or paying attention to the way kids play? I taught a class a few weeks ago at a church here in town, and I said, let's be attentive to how little kids play. Small children give away signs. So in the case that we were discussing, it was sexualized play with Barbies, for example. So that might be something that if parents knew, so my kids shouldn't be playing inappropriately sexually with their toys, that might be an indication of something else happening in that child's home, or something has maybe happened, or curiosity. And we need to fill the gap, because there are too many bad actors out there who are willing to fill that time and give our kids attention, whether it's in online spaces or in physical spaces. And we need to take our rightful position as the cornerstone in our children's lives now more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's a really important point to end on, which is that besides educating ourselves about grooming, it is really important for us to continue educating ourselves around what is developmentally age appropriate behavior for kids. Because I see a lot of times things that get dismissed that should be followed up on. I think all behavior, whether it's green, yellow, or red flag, it all needs intervention, education, and redirection. And so that includes behaviors that may be developmentally appropriate, but we want to always find out the source of where that behavior could have come from if it was something different than what we might just brush off as innocent. Kids need that education. And unfortunately, if we're not doing it, the internet is going to do it for us. And that's definitely not where we want our kids to get their information from. Anna, thank you so much for joining me today. There's so many more questions I wanted to ask, but I know that I think we gave our audience enough to whet their palate and say, okay, this is definitely a book that is worth picking up. And I want to just highlight how you have been so meticulous in sharing so many golden nuggets of information that are actionable and that give parents solutions and the confidence to really have these really important conversations, because we are really the front line that our kids need, that firewall of protection. As they're starting to learn about body safety themselves, we really have to be the ones on the front lines, making sure that we're not creating opportunity and access, and that we're educated so that we can educate others and create those communities that can be safe and supportive. Thank you so much for writing the book, for doing this work. How can people find you? How can people access the book?
Thank you so much. Those are very kind words. And this is a real mission project for me because I want all of kids, as many as possible, to get this information and for parents to feel that sense of empowerment and confidence, which has been a little bit missing in the past. People can look up the book, Duck Groom, Understanding How a Child Becomes a Target. It's available on Amazon. It has a Kindle version and an audiobook version. And I also published a workbook journal for adult survivors of child sexual abuse, evaluating and recognizing the signs of grooming, because too often we have ignored that it is not lightning. It does not come out of nowhere. There's a gradual ramp up to child sexual abuse, and too many survivors have been burdened by undue shame and guilt for things that were never, ever their fault. Those two items are available on Amazon, and I'm always available if people have questions or just want to email me. My website is duckduckgroom.com or annasonoda.com. And I want to take a minute to thank you for everything you're doing to educate families and give children a bright future and empower those parents to do the right thing. So thank you, Rosalia, for having me and making the time to talk about grooming.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And we're in this together. So I feel like we're colleagues in this space. And I hope that everyone who is listening today got lots of value and will put this into action and pick up your book. Anna, thank you so much. And I will post the links in the show notes for all of those links that you just mentioned. I actually picked up both the audiobook and the physical book because once I listened to it, I was like, I need to take notes and bookmark stuff. So I got a copy of the hard copy as well. And I just want to recommend it to everyone, whether your child is 2 or 21, even. You can pass this on if you have older kids who are thinking about working with children. This is a really great book. If they're going off to school and they're looking at working within any kind of youth serving organization, this is a really fantastic book for them as well. So thanks again, Anna. I hope that everyone enjoyed it. Let us know your comments. Tag me on Instagram or social media and let us know what you took away from today's episode and what you want others to know. Thanks so much again. Take care.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode and don't want to miss the next one, be sure to subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach more ears, please take 1 minute to post a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. Your review helps the algorithm do its thing and reach more listeners. And if you found this useful, share about it on your social channels and tag me at Consent Parenting on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, or X. Let's continue to create consent culture one conversation at a time. Stay empowered.